Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come. It's really a pleasure to meet all of you and to be here for this workshop. And what I'm going to be talking to you today is about the contribution of integrated geoarchaeological methods into the interpretation of the life histories of rural settlements. So just talking very specifically about geoarchaeology, of course, not mentioning too much about the other really valuable methods, and one that we haven't talked too much about, for example, pollen, which can tell you about kind of the biography of landscape evolution in an area alongside your settlement. So I'm just going to focus on geoarchaeology. And the biographical approach to settlement archaeology is something that I guess all of us are already sold on, or else we wouldn't be here. And it's an approach that allows you to really look at the arrow of time on your site. And I would myself extend that arrow to include maybe a few other phases that we haven't talked too much about. One is the pre-settlement environment. We talked a little bit about whether there are previous activities at a site, such as agricultural activities, but in fact that the pre-settlement environment tells you very much about the landscape that the people inherited who settled on a site. And not all sites are preceded by agriculture. So that's a phase that I think is important to look at. Also the preparation of the site itself for the settlement. So before you even start to construct the buildings, there are often activities that take place that change that site and prepare it a little bit. And I think that's something that we can also try to understand using geoarchaeological methods. And after the abandonment, occupation abandonment of a site, I would also say that post-depositional processes are something that we haven't talked too much about yet. And geoarchaeological methods really lend themselves to the analysis of post-depositional processes, by which I mean the soil formation processes that take over a site after it's been abandoned by the people who inhabited it. And of course, later activities at a site that may have nothing to do with the earlier occupation of the site, but may impinge on it in some way. And as part of this long biography of a particular place, so biography of a place, more than just a settlement, but the biography of a place, looking at it as a whole. And the most complicated bit to get to is actually the occupation phase. And the reason for that is that it's incredibly complex and in fact sometimes very cyclical in terms of the number of changes that can take place during the course of a settlement's life. So we have changes in the size and configuration and status of the household itself, and obviously the needs of that household will change what happens on site in terms of the spaces that are needed, the sizes of the buildings that are needed, and so on. Food processing needs might change, storage needs might change. You might need different kinds of animals, so you want different kinds of animal enclosures on a site over time. And this might have to do with changing economics, but it could also have to do with changing status. It could also have to do with changing ideologies, worldviews, and all of these things can change a site while it's being occupied. Something that we also haven't talked about much are maintenance activities. So this is not just remodeling a house or re-establishing a post hole or re-establishing a post in order to maintain a house over time, but also maintenance of floor layers, which is something that you really have to start thinking about if you're trying to understand what the floor layers are telling you on a site. My own experience has been that a lot of the deposits, a lot of the residues that end up on a floor layer have not to do with the actual activities that took place there by the residents, but have to do more with maintenance activities, such as reflooring, resurfacing, putting material on the floor in order to make it easier to live on, drier to live on, more comfortable to live on. And so lots of material can get into a floor that have nothing to do with the actual occupation, and in terms of activities that were taking place there on a daily basis. So maintenance of floor layers is something that has a big impact on occupation deposits. So all of these things make occupation layers really, really complex. I myself work in an area that allows you to really analyze that complexity, because we really have the preservation of these floor layers, as I'll be showing you. Now, geoarchaeological contributions to these questions are, I think, have a lot of potential. I myself think that micromorphology is probably the most powerful method in our arsenal to look at really all of these phases that I just talked about, from the pre-site environment through the occupation of the site to the post-depositional processes and later activity at the site as well. So what micromorphology is, for those of you who aren't familiar with the technique, it requires that you take an undisturbed sample from the site. It can be in a tin, but it doesn't have to be. It can just be, if the material is consolidated enough, it can just be cut out with a knife or a trowel. And in the laboratory, it's dried, impregnated with a resin, and then thin section. So this is Julie Borum working in the lab in Cambridge, thin sectioning the soil down to a thickness. Usually the thin sections are about 30 micrometers thick, so that's 0.03 millimeters thick, at which thickness you can shine light through it, and you can see the components, all of the components of the soil, from the minerals through to the organic matter, to artifacts, bones, absolutely everything. And you see it in its original context. You see it in its original location, orientation, because it was an undisturbed sample. So this is one of the things that makes the technique so powerful. And the skills you need to analyze that aren't any different from the skills that you would need to analyze a petrographic thin section. Just a few different components to understand in terms of soils. But there are other techniques that we use as well for looking at horizontal differences in the use of space, looking at different activity areas in that occupation of a site. So you might sample on a grid, as my colleagues are doing here at a site called Svegakot in Iceland, and then using these bulk samples to analyze things like magnetic susceptibility. It's being done here by my colleague Andre Balbo. Organic content analysis, multi-element analysis. You can look at lipids now. So there's all sorts of different techniques that we can use if you sample systematically on a grid to understand the use of space better at activity areas. Now, to give you a series of examples of the sorts of things I have been talking about, I'm going to draw on 5 different sites that all are contemporary with each other. They all date to the 10th century. They're all in Iceland. And the reason why I've chosen these ones is because they've been studied at least with micromorphology, and most of them have been studied using a whole range of different geoarchaeological methods. And I'm not going to be able to talk you through the biographies of each of these sites. That would be impossible in the time allowed, but I'm going to run through these different phases of sites, of settlement sites, to, if you like, different phases of a biography, a potential biography, and draw on the most interesting examples that I have from all of these sites to demonstrate the methods and how they can be used. So as you can see, there's a wide range of sites here. Most of these are farmsteads. Some of them, it's only the longhouse that's been excavated, such as at Hrísbrú and Alastraiti, which is a site in Reykjavik. But at Vatnsfjörður, which I myself was excavating between 2005 and 2013, we have the entire site, the entire farmstead was preserved there. The longhouse, the smithy, pit house, series of storage buildings, boat houses, and so on. At Hofstadr, longhouse and pit houses. And I also have included a shieling site, which is a seasonal site. It's a site for transhumant agriculture, very important in throughout Northern Europe, but also in alpine areas. So these are sites which people go to during the summertime to increase the access to grazing for their animals. And the reason why it's important to talk about shielings is because these are sites where there's punctuated occupation. They're not permanently occupied, they're seasonally occupied. And you can see that in the micromorphology samples. So we have a good signal for seasonal occupation now. So I thought that's an important thing to consider as well in terms of understanding a biography of a site. So, if you wonder why I spend so much time working in Iceland, it's because we have sites like this where it's not just the negative features that are preserved on the site, but in fact all of the occupation layers, because the arable agriculture has been pretty much non-existent in Iceland, very, very little barley cultivation, and and because the construction of the houses is largely in turf and in stone, there's a net accumulation of material on sites, so that sites build up over time, and sites that have been occupied for a very, very long time are now in the form of mounds. So there are many, many hundreds, thousands probably, of farm mounds in the country where there are Viking Age occupation layers at the bottom and modern houses on the top. And so you have, if you like, the whole biography of that settlement preserved within a mound. This particular site in Reykjavik has what is really typical, which is a floor layer preserved, and you can see the walls here. So just to give you an example of how we can look at the pre-site environment, at Aðalstræti, a number of micromorphology samples were taken from within the house, and also a column was taken from the soils adjacent to the house by Ian Simpson, who is a colleague at the University of Stirling in Scotland, who is really interested in farm and agricultural soils and home field amendment. So he took that column and analysed those samples. And what we can see in the samples, that the parts of the samples that predate the settlement, is that there was substantial movement of material by earthworms, which is important because it means that it was it was a living biological soil. It was fertile. There was, however, also a lot of fluctuating water. So these evidence for that comes in the form of these iron nodules, these reddish-brown nodules, which form when you have a wetting and drying situation on a site. And there's also freeze-thaw processes that are affecting the site. So when you get cappings, like silt cappings like this, that's as a result of freezing and thawing. So what you're looking at here is an image of a thin section. It's a photograph taken of a thin section. And the scale here, this is 0.5 millimeter across, 500 microns. So what you're looking at, this is a sand grain. This is pore space that you can see in white, and all of the brown that you can see here this is all soil material with lots of different minerals inside. These are all volcanic sands that you can see inside here. And this is the silt capping I was referring to. So this is a thin section that was taken from the floor of the house. And this is actually, it's divided into a number of phases. The pre-house floor is this lower one. Where this white layer is actually a tephra layer. This is a volcanic ash layer that dates to 871 plus or minus 2. If you go by one of the Greenland ice cores, the other Greenland ice core suggests that it can be dated to 874 plus or minus 6. So, but we have very good date for this particular tephra layer. And what we can see is that throughout the site where the tephra layer is just before, just after it was deposited, there was signs of disturbance, and then you get accumulation of occupation deposits. So this is the actual floor. And then you have, afterwards, a sequence of turf collapse. So what you can see here is that this white material, this is actually the tephra layer, again, which was inside every single piece of turf that was used to construct the house. So this, what you're looking at is the turf collapse from the roof onto the floor of the house. Okay, so that's sealing the floor deposits, and that's a very typical situation in Icelandic settlement sites. So this is how we can get information about what's happening after the site was abandoned. So what I wanted to kind of emphasize here was the concept of landscape inheritance, and this is where I think all of the studies of the pre-site environment and pre-site activities are really important, because whoever settles on that site takes over a site that has had a previous existence, and the fertility of the soils is dependent on the activities that took place there beforehand, for example. Very often we see that the ground is being prepared for settlement. So this is the site of Vatnsfjörður in the northwest of Iceland, where I've been excavating. This is the plan of the site. And when you look at the sections around the site, you can see the sequence of natural soils. And what's really remarkable about the site is that they change. So we have, previous to this, the settlement of the site, the soils that developed there were podsols. After the settlement of the site, the soils that accumulated were andasols, which are windblown soils, and they're more typical for the rest of Iceland. And because of the differences in the soils there, we were able to see that parts of the site actually were deturfed prior to the establishment of buildings, and some parts of the site were not. So that white horizon that's typical for podsols, the eluviated horizon, shows up underneath some buildings. So this is a little storage building, this one here. And you can see that white horizon there, which is actually just the white, the E horizon of a podsol preserved there. And you can actually see bits of that E horizon in the surrounding turf as well. And if you look at thin sections, this is the smithy, you can actually, again, see that eluviated horizon down here. This is the floor layer, and this is the turf collapse and later activity on top of the floor. So we can see that there's parts of the site that were being deturfed in order to prepare them for occupation, and some were not deturfed. So this is how things varied across the site. So you have some buildings where they purposefully removed the turf, went right down to the underlying beach cobble layer. This is very, very old former beach down here, in order to prepare that floor. That's what they wanted for that floor, whereas in some areas they wanted to have still the turf there, the original turf. So inside some of those buildings, you can envision a house that was constructed. They actually would have still had the living grass probably on the floor, and that's gradually died away while they were occupying the structure. Okay, so that's what we would envision for a house like this. So that's what I mean by preparation of the ground for settlement. That's something interesting to think about. Then there's the building materials, the building construction materials themselves and the methods for constructing the house. So this is the longhouse at Vatnsfjörður. And what you can see is that the walls were constructed of this podsol turf. So you can actually see it. You can see that even that it was laid upside down, okay, because of the order of the soil horizons. So you would normally have the black soil at the top, right? Then the eluviated horizon, which is white or gray, and then the reddish B horizon down below. That's the typical sequence for a podsol. And here they're all reversed. They've all been turned upside down so that you have the black A horizon, the eluviated horizon, and the reddish horizon, and another black eluviated horizon. So it keeps going all the way up. So you can see that this is a very common method for construction, even on turf houses right up until the early 20th century. The turf was turned upside down, and we know now it goes back to the Viking Age. And so in some of the walls, they interleave the turf with gravel, and so you can actually see these turf layers, these podsolized turf layers interleaving with a bit of gravel, probably just at the foundation level, and then they built up the turf walls on top of that. So geoarchaeological, this didn't require even thin section analysis, but just an understanding of soil development can help you understand the construction materials used for this house. This is the site of Hrísbrú, which is in the Mosfellsbær area of southwest Iceland, and this is another longhouse dating to the 10th century. It was extended, so this is an extension at the back of the house, and this is the entranceway here, and you can see in red all the locations of all the micromorphology samples, these little red squares. So the first thing to note in terms of building construction is that in the entranceway there were several impressions that looked like there had been wood panels, floorboards, but they were completely decomposed, and it wasn't possible to get a proper wood sample to analyze. So I took a risk to see what would happen. I pressed a micromorphology sampling tin into the floor. You can see that here. And most of the thin section of wood was really too heavily decayed to identify, but there were areas where it was possible to say that there was ring porous wood, that's a deciduous wood, probably oak or ash, which is not native to the country. And most of the building wood used in Iceland came from driftwood, which is all coniferous. So we know that they used imported timber to floor their floorboards, to construct wooden floors in the entrance, and probably in this western part of the house, where you can see that there's no accumulation of floor. So the black layer is where there's floor accumulation, but there's no floor visible here. It's probably because it was floorboarded. This is really important. Riesbroe is thought to have been a high status site, and the ability to import timber to show off that you had the wealth to do that and to make an impressive entrance is, I think, really significant to our understanding of the site. So that's, again, thanks to a thin section that we got that information. This is a site called Adelstræti, so this is in Reykjavik, and this is a site that I think provides a good example for our analysis of the occupation phase of a site. All of these little lines that you can see, I hope I'm really showing up well here, yeah. So these are all different occupation layers that were defined by the excavators of the site back in 2001. These are the locations of the artifacts, which I thought were not particularly useful in terms of helping us understand activity areas within the structure. But you can see that there's lots of post-hole alignments, areas where probably a central post was being repositioned again and again, rebuilt and repaired over time. And so what can we make of this? Well, we used a number of different methods to try to tease out more information about different activity areas around the house. One was micro-refuse analysis. So this is the use of microscopic artifacts and bone fragments. You can see the distribution of bone here. The larger bones are in red and the smaller bones are in blue. And the size of the triangle tells you the concentration. And these are the burnt bones on this side. So the burnt bones are telling you where fire waste, hearth waste was being dumped. And as you can see, it's accumulating in and around the hearth, but it's also getting scattered all around the floor. And there's a dump of it here close to this entranceway. And that, I think, is not coincidental, because I think that ash was probably commonly used as one of these maintenance methods that I told you about. So based on ethnographic work I've done in Iceland on early 20th century sites, where they were purposefully storing ash and then sprinkling it on their floors to fill in holes, absorb moisture, dampen odors. I think that this tradition goes way, way back, because on many sites that I've worked on dating to the Viking Age in Iceland, we actually have lots and lots of ash deposition throughout the whole of the house, even in areas that are not adjacent to the hearth. And so that's what I meant when to consider maintenance practices as being a part of that habitation of the house. So the distribution of bones and burnt bones don't always tell you about activities that took place on that spot other than maintenance activities. Okay, but just an idea there for you to think about in terms of how material is getting moved around a site. And situations in which elemental analysis is useful or not. So this is, we did multi-element analysis. This is phosphate analysis. And what you can see is that highest phosphate levels are actually showing up in those ashy areas. And then there's an accumulation of high phosphorus also on this eastern side of the house, where in fact there was a very organic accumulation there, which I was able to study in more detail in thin section. But in fact, what the excavators thought was the most organic layers were up here. And this is in fact an area where there's a number of post-hole alignments that suggested that this was an animal stabling area, and that was confirmed in the thin section, but it didn't show up as a particularly high area for phosphate analysis. And I think that's because the pH was fairly neutral there, so we lost the phosphate. Magnetic susceptibility works. Here you can see where there's been magnetic enhancement because of heating of soils, except I already knew it was a hearth in this particular case. But if you are looking for a hearth on your site, you can use magnetic susceptibility as a way of trying to identify that area. And I also used electrical conductivity as a way of looking for areas where there's been enhanced nutrients. I was thinking particularly of phosphorus, but it turned out to be something that was not related to the phosphorus distribution at all, which you can see down here. Okay, so there was no elevation of phosphorus. So it turned out that this was probably related to soluble salt input into the soil, most probably from urine, but possibly also seaweed use, some kind of seaweed use. So, but personally, I think this was an area where there are some barrels where they were probably storing urine, which was commonly used for cleaning wool. So, in case this comes as a surprise to you, urine, when it's left to become stale, becomes really alkaline. You know, that ammonia smell that we associate with it, very alkaline. And to make a soap, you just take an alkaline fluid and you mix it with fat, and sheep fleece comes with its own lanolin. It comes with its own grease. So you can wash sheep fleeces in urine and it suds up and gets all soapy and it cleans them. And then all you do is rinse them off in a flowing stream and you have nice clean sheepskins. And this was a method for cleaning sheepskins and wool in Iceland again until the early 20th century. So that's probably what was going on in that corner of the house, I suspect. Or it could have been used as a dyeing area. A number of micromorphology samples, again, all those in red. So this area, very organic deposit here. And you can see really, really compacted layers. All of these more grayish horizons are actually phytoliths, compacted phytoliths. These are coming from plant grasses, plants like grasses and other herbaceous plants. But when you look at the phytoliths, you can see that they're mainly grass stems. And so I think that this is an area where grass was used as bedding, this part of the house. And in contrast, this part of the house, the floor deposits were so patchy that, as you can see, they didn't even define context here. But the patches of floor deposit looked like this, so completely different from the other side of the house. Looked as the same scale and everything. So these are quite largish bone fragments, about a couple of millimeters in size. This is a charcoal fragment. This is also bone. And I think that this is floor material that's getting, you can see it's not compacted. All the white space is pore space. So it's not trampled. And it looks like there was a wooden platform here, and this is floor material that was protected and not trampled in an area where there was some furnishing. So, because in the thin section you can see the degree of compaction, because you can see how the degree of porosity, you can have an idea of heavy traffic areas and light traffic areas. And you can see where there's some furniture, for example, where people weren't able to trample. That totally backed up what the excavators thought about that area as well, but they didn't tell me until after I had done the analysis. Sneaky. And this is an area where it looks like there was different kinds of excrement accumulating, both herbivore but also probably human. A number of bone fragments there that looked like they had gone through the journey through the digestive tract, if you know what I mean. Yeah. This area here, this is typical herbivore dung. So this is an area that had lots and lots of tiny crumbs of what looked like sheep and goat dung. You can compare it to a reference sample. This is a sheep dung reference sample. So you can see that grasses get chopped up, and you have lots of fine fragments of articulated phytoliths in them, which are then compacted together and randomly oriented. This is really typical for sheep or goat dung. So I think that they were storing sheep or goat dung close to the hearth in order to use it as a fuel. That's just a guess. We didn't have any big pieces of proper dung. This was all crumbs, which were literally 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter in size. Okay, so tiny, tiny little crumbs. You can just see them here. So, put that all together and you're able to construct something like an idea of what this house was like just in one phase of time, of course. Because what you can't present very easily in a plan like this is the multiple phases that you get within each thin section. Okay, so we would have to do multiple versions of this plan in order to look at a house changing over time. So this is kind of a flashpoint in time, if you like. And sometimes you can get unexpected nuances. So this is the house in Hrísbrú again, where around the barrel pit right here. So this is a feature which is again really common on these Viking Age sites: a flat pit circular pit, but completely flat, often lined with stones or sand, and it was a placement for a barrel, probably for storing food, and such as, meat products, for one, were often stored in soured whey, kind of like a brine type thing. This was, again, a technique used right up until the early 20th century. But what we didn't expect to find, and what didn't show up when they were analysing all of the faunal material, the bones from the site, was that butchery practices looked like were taking place right here. And you get this only from the smallest fragments, because in the thin section I could see that there were bone fragments that had been chopped. They had these really clear, chop marks. These are not natural. These are cut marks here. And so this was clearly an area not just for food storage, but for food preparation. And then looking on this end of the house, we can see that this was probably a cattle byre as part of this extension here. So there's two aisles, and they probably, again, were using this for cattle. And you can see this because it's, again, full of phytoliths, which it looked like it was hay, but in some areas it also looks like it's herbivore dung. And at the same time, the micro-refuse analysis showed something surprising, which was a concentration of hammer scale and slag in that part of the house. Obviously, that was not taking place at the same time as animals were being kept there. So you have to think about the complexity of the use of space of a house. And in the summertime, when the cattle were grazing, the byre end of the house was clearly being used for other things, including some metalworking. So this is the site that I mentioned that was a shealing site called post-depositional. And I know I just can see that I'm going to have to wind up soon, so I just want to speed through this. And essentially, what we have at sites that have been periodically occupied is a sequence of very, very thin occupation deposits separated by deposits of windblown sand. And this is the case not just for Icelandic sites, but also for Scottish ones. So we've done ethnographic work on really, really recently abandoned sheilings in the Western Isles of Scotland. And there also we have the signature of thin occupation deposits and quite thick accumulations of sand that accumulated during the winter times when the site was not occupied, and then another thin occupation layer. So at Pálstoftir, in this particular room, the occupation layers were so ephemeral. You can see one right here. There's another one, the arrow is pointing to it. It's just here. And then there's another one here. You can just see some horizontal banding there. And these are just slight organic stains and some, again, grasses that are preserved in those floor layers. Okay, so, but at least here we have a signal for permanent and periodic occupation. Now, just to wrap up here, come to the kind of conclusion of the biographies of these sites. Sometimes you can see how buildings are being closed really well in geoarchaeological samples. So this section, this one just here, something really special happened with the abandonment of this particular pit house, and in fact many of the buildings at Hofstadr in northeast Iceland. It looks like the roofs were purposefully collapsed. So it looks like the posts were removed and the house was very purposefully deconstructed. This, for those of you who aren't aware of this site, it was a site of quite stunning ritual activity in the form of cattle slaughter. So cattle were being poleaxed and beheaded. So it was a site of pagan significance, pagan ritual significance, and it's not impossible that, because there's also a really early church at Hofstadr, that this closing of the site, of the pagan part of the site, was contemporary with the movement of the settlement and the establishment of the church. That happened about between 1000 and 1100. And in thin section, you can see, again, these really organized turves. So here you can see all of these grayish layers are that the so-called Landnam Tefra layer, that 180 to 871 plus or minus 2 that I mentioned. So you can see those showing up here as well. So that these are occupation layers within the pit house. Here's a very thin one on the eastern part of the pit house, and this is a central floor layer inside the pit house where there's lots of charcoal and burnt bone accumulation. And then just we have a sealing of these deposits by these intentional collapse of the house. Post-depositional processes. Well, this is Hriesbru, and we can see a number of things. One is bioturbation. This is again one of the cattle byre samples that, because of how palatable the organic matter was and all that excrement, it was completely reworked by earthworms as part of it. And these are actually all earthworm excrements. So you can see what they were chewing up. You can see that they were chewing up what was originally hay layers or cow excrements, but they're now in the form of earthworm excrements, and that's why this looks like a layer of microaggregates. And later on, we have evidence for water deposits inside. So lots of sorted lenses, finding up sequences, and it's clear that water was bringing in sediment into the area of the ruins, and was all the sediment there is accumulating with water. It's the same thing at Adelstreite, where we get puddling occurring after the settlement there in the ruins, but also clear evidence for leaching. So in terms of post-depositional processes, all of these ash layers are sometimes only preserved in the form of charcoal now, because wood ash is really, really soluble. It's made up of silt-sized calcium carbonate, and it's very easily soluble in rainwater. So often what we get are black floor layers. These would have looked white or grey originally when the site was being occupied, and it's only as a post-depositional process that all you get is residual charcoal in them. So that's why we get so much charcoal and not much wood ash. The wood ash is all dissolved away, it's all leached away. A really important post-depositional process for you to think about, because it changes the character of your site so much. The color of it, the texture of it, the thickness of it can be altered by leaching. Okay, so that's one important thing to think about. And then, of course, we get later activities. So on top of the turf collapse and all that kind of water infiltration, we are getting later dumping events at Adelstreite. And eventually the site was turned over to agriculture. We can see that it was used as a hay field, and it was amended. It was amended soils there in that hay field. Okay. So just to kind of summarize, I'm sorry I've gone over a little bit. We have individual buildings and rural settlements as a whole that have really unique biographies. And that's hopefully what I've shown you just through a scattering of all of these different case studies, that every single one is unique. And so we can't generalize really about a biography of a settlement, or what settlement biographies in a region might be like, because I think there's so much site-specific character to think about, due to a particular social environment, what the inhabitants were like, what their status was like, what their worldviews were, what their functional requirements were. And geoarchaeological methods can contribute to that level of detail, at high resolution detail that you need about specific sites and specific buildings. But different types of geoarchaeological methods lend themselves to different parts of this investigation and biography. Micromorphology, I think, is a very powerful method, because from pre-site to post-site abandonment and post-depositional processes, it gives you that whole story. But you can't take a micromorphology sample everywhere. The sampling method and the analysis of it doesn't allow you to do that. But the specific kind of targeting of those samples would be really important. And then to look at an area horizontally in terms of activity areas during the occupation of the site, a whole range of different geoarchaeological methods, really, really beneficial to capture that complexity of the occupation phase and micro changes over time. So just to end it there, and to thank you to everybody who have contributed to that.